The morning Kate Chandler signed her name on that deed. She felt the ink dry beneath her fingers before she even lifted the pen, and it was only then that she saw the name already written above hers in a hand that was not her own. The summer of 1873 had settled over Harlan County, Texas, like a wool blanket soaked through with heat, and Kate had arrived in the town of Dustcreek on the noon stage from San Antonio with 2 trunks, a small cedar box of her mother's jewelry, and the kind of exhaustion that comes not from the body but from the soul. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher by trade and by genuine passion, and she had come west because the East had swallowed up everyone she loved and left her with nothing but a rented room and a job that paid barely enough to keep her in ink and paper. Her father had died the previous winter. Her mother had been gone since Kate was 16. Her older brother Thomas had gone to work for the railroads 3 years prior and had written only twice since, both letters thin on feeling and heavy on excuses. So when she had read the advertisement placed by the Dustcreek School Board in the San Antonio Express, seeking a qualified schoolteacher to take over a one-room schoolhouse in exchange for modest pay and a small dwelling, she had answered it the same afternoon and received a formal letter of offer within a fortnight. The stage rolled into Dustcreek just as the lunch hour was ending, and the town was shaking itself back to life. Kate pressed her face to the window and took in what would be her new home. A single main street of packed red earth, flanked by a general store, a telegraph office, a barbershop, a saloon called the Desert Rose, a feed and grain supplier, a modest church of white-painted timber, and a scattering of adobe and wooden structures that housed families and businesses in various combinations. Beyond the town proper, the land opened up into wide, bronze-colored range crossed by the occasional ribbon of green where water ran underground. In the far distance, a line of low hills shimmered in the heat like something half-remembered. She stepped out of the stage and was immediately hit by the smell of horses, dust, and the faint sweetness of something baking from the direction of what turned out to be Me Ellen Pruitt's bakehouse, a small operation that Me Ellen ran out of her kitchen 3 mornings a week, and which Kate would eventually come to depend on deeply for its cinnamon rolls and its conversation. Miss Chandler, a man in a brown vest and round spectacles, stepped forward with his hand extended. He was perhaps 50, with a wide, sun-worn face and the sort of careful beard that suggested a man who took personal dignity seriously. "I am Arthur Denny. I chair the school board here in Dustcreek. Welcome." Kate shook his hand and managed a smile that she meant. "Thank you, Mr. Denny. I am glad to be here. We are glad to have you. Your predecessor, Miss Holloway, she left us rather suddenly. Family matters in Missouri, we were told. The children have been without a teacher for nearly 2 months, and it shows." He said the last with a look of resigned suffering that made Kate want to laugh, and she appreciated him for it. "I will have them in order," she said, and she meant that too. He helped arrange for her trunks to be carried to the schoolhouse dwelling, which was attached to the rear of the schoolhouse itself. It was a plain room with a narrow iron-framed bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, a wood stove, and a window that looked out over an open yard where a lone cottonwood tree grew, its leaves catching whatever light breeze the afternoon offered. It was not much, but it was hers, entirely and officially hers, and that felt like more than she could properly articulate. She unpacked her books first, as she always did, lining them along the edge of the desk, and then she unpacked her clothes, and then she set her mother's cedar box on the windowsill where the light would catch it in the mornings. She washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into a fresh dress of pale blue cotton, and stepped out to begin learning her town. It was on that first walk, in the gold-slanted late afternoon, that she saw Isaiah Holloway for the first time. He was outside the feed and grain store, loading heavy canvas sacks onto a flatbed wagon with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this so many times that thought was no longer required. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck beneath a dusty brown hat. His face, when he straightened to shift a sack, was angular and serious, tanned deep by years of working sun, with dark eyes that moved across his surroundings with a kind of steady awareness that Kate noticed even from a distance. He wore no gun on his hip, which she noticed only because nearly every other man she had passed on that walk wore one. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and his hands were large and capable-looking, and he was, she thought quite without meaning too, one of the most striking men she had ever seen. He glanced up and caught her looking. Kate did not look away in time and felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the August sun. He held her gaze for just a moment, then gave a short, polite nod of acknowledgement and turned back to his work. She walked on, telling herself firmly that she had come to Dustcreek to teach children and build a life, not to stare at cowboys outside feed stores. She asked me Ellen Prude about him 3 days later, because me Ellen was already becoming her primary source of town information, and also because the cinnamon rolls truly were extraordinary. Isaiah Holloway. Me Ellen wiped flour from her hands and settled into the chair across the small kitchen table with the settled pleasure of a woman who rarely met a question she did not want to answer. Now there is a story, Miss Chandler. He runs the Broken Spur Ranch about 4 miles east of town. His family homesteaded that land when he was just a boy, came out from Tennessee. His father passed 8 years back and his mother moved to live with her sister in Dallas. Isaiah stayed. Runs the whole operation himself with a handful of good hands. Best cattle operation in this part of the county, some would say. She paused, pressing her lips together. He is a good man. Honest, serious. Does not say much, but when he does say something, it means something. He brings in his cattle drives clean and fair. He pays his debts, and he fixed the church roof last spring out of his own pocket and told the pastor not to mention it from the pulpit. She gave Kate a considering look. He is 30 years old and unmarried, and every mother in a 30-mile radius has at some point tried and failed to remedy that situation. Kate smiled and said nothing to that, but she thought about it. She had her hands full with the school, which was true enough to settle any argument she might have had with herself. There were 14 children between the ages of 6 and 13, and they were exactly as undisciplined as Arthur Denny had warned. The older boys were particularly resistant to the idea of being confined indoors on a September morning when the range was right there, wide and inviting, and their fathers were working horses and cattle. Kate handled them with a combination of genuine warmth and absolute refusal to be cowed, and within 2 weeks she had established a classroom culture that worked. She saw Isaiah Holloway again at the general store on a Saturday morning, about 3 weeks after her arrival. She was comparing the merits of 2 different lots of writing paper when she became aware of him at the counter, speaking quietly to Jim Ferris, the store owner, about an order of wire for fencing. She kept her eyes on the paper. He finished his business and turned to go, and she thought he had not noticed her at all, which she was completely indifferent to, but then he paused. Miss Chandler. His voice was low and even, and hearing her name in it was a peculiar small surprise. She turned. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she found unexpectedly endearing for a reason she could not name. I hope the school is treating you well. It is, thank you, Mr. Holloway. She was pleased with how steady her own voice was. The children are coming along. A small, brief smile crossed his face. Not the practiced social smile she was used to seeing on men who were trying to make an impression, but something quieter and more genuine. That is a polite way of putting it, I imagine. They are good children, she said, because she genuinely believed it. They just need consistency. He nodded, as though she had said something worth agreeing with, and put his hat back on. My ranch is east of town if you ever need anything and cannot reach someone in town. The road is well marked. He said it simply, without any particular significance in his tone, and then he wished her a good morning and walked out. Kate stood with the writing paper in her hand for a moment, looking at the door he had gone through. Then she took the better of the 2 lots, paid Jim Ferris, and walked back to the schoolhouse, thinking about consistency. October came in with a long stretch of clear, cool days that turned the cottonwood leaves gold and made the evenings something to look forward to. The town had a harvest social on the third Saturday of the month, held in the yard behind the church, and Kate went because Ellen had told her firmly that failing to attend would be considered a statement. She wore her best dress, which was a deep green with a white collar, and she pinned her brown hair up with careful attention and arrived to find half of Dustcreek already there, the other half arriving in the following half hour. There was food on long tables, a fiddle player from Bixar County who apparently came every year, and a succession of square dances that Kate had not participated in since she was a girl in Virginia, but found that her body remembered well enough. She danced with Arthur Denny's son, a good-natured boy of 20 who stepped on her feet only twice. She danced with the barber, Mr. Chastain, who was a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man of his particular shape. She ate cornbread and roasted venison and talked to the mothers of her students, and she was having, she realized with some surprise, a genuinely fine time. It was after the second round of dancing that Isaiah Holloway appeared at her elbow, and she was startled partly because she had not seen him arrive and partly because of the immediate response in her chest, which she was becoming increasingly annoyed with. "I do not dance," he said, by way of introduction to his presence. "Then why come to a social?" she asked without heat. He looked at the crowd around them with an expression that suggested the question was one he had asked himself. Ellen brings food that a person cannot get elsewhere, and Arthur Denny needs people to show up so he feels the community is in good health. He glanced at her. "And I heard the new schoolteacher had settled in well, and I thought I would see for myself." It was the most personal thing he had said to her yet, and she met it by looking back at the fiddle player with what she hoped was a casual expression. "And what is your verdict?" "You look like you belong here," he said, and his voice when he said it was simple and direct and without any particular attempt at flattery, and it hit her somewhere she had not been expecting. She looked at him and he was looking at her, and the fiddle played on behind them, and in the cool October night with the paper lantern swaying above the yard, something shifted between them that neither of them quite named. He stayed beside her for the better part of an hour. They talked about the school, about his cattle operation, about the winter she should prepare for, and the way the wind came off the hills in January. He asked her about Virginia, and she told him about it with the comfortable nostalgia of someone who loved a place without being able to go back to it. He told her about Tennessee, which he had left as a boy of 8 and could only partly remember, but what he did remember he held with the same quality of feeling. His father had built the broken spur from bare land, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her understand how much of himself he had put into continuing that work. When she went home that night, she sat at her little writing desk and looked at the dark window for a long time before she lit the lamp. Over the weeks that followed, she began to understand that Isaiah Holloway's way of paying attention to something was unlike other people's. He did not announce it. He did not make a performance of interest. But the next time she was at the general store, Jim Farris mentioned that someone had prepaid for a subscription to the Dallas Morning News to be delivered weekly to the school, and that he thought it might be useful for the teacher and the children alike. Jim said the benefactor had preferred not to be named, but was not particularly good at hiding it, and he left it at that. Kate read the first issue that evening with a feeling in her chest that was becoming familiar and unwieldy. He rode past the school on Tuesdays when he came into town for business, and he began stopping, not every Tuesday but enough of them, to check whether she needed anything carried or repaired. Her wood stove had a pipe that drew poorly, and he fixed it in 40 minutes one November morning, working with the focused quiet of a man who did not need to fill silence with noise. She made coffee on the stove that now worked properly, and they sat at the schoolroom's 2 adult-sized chairs and talked about the annexation of Texas and about whether the railroad coming into the county would help or harm ranching operations, and she thought then that she had not had a conversation that engaged her completely in a very long time. She did not tell herself she was falling in love because she was a practical woman with a practical life, and she had only known this man for 2 months. But she stopped being surprised when she found herself thinking about him during the day, and she stopped pretending that Tuesday was not her favorite day of the week. November brought cold nights and a community crisis of some significance. Word came through on a Thursday that a man named Clarence Yet, who owned a substantial tract of land 2 miles west of the Broken Spur, had sold his property to a land speculation firm out of Fort Worth that intended to parcel it up and sell it in sections, several of which bordered common range that small ranch operators in the area depended on for seasonal grazing. There was a meeting at the church that Sunday after services, and the room was tight with people and tight with anger. Kate sat toward the back and listened, because this was not her fight in any direct sense, but it was her community's fight, and that mattered to her. She watched Isaiah stand at the front of the room, not as the loudest voice but as the most listened to one. He laid out the situation plainly, without inflaming it, and then he proposed a counteroffer from a collective of local ranchers who would pool resources and purchase the bordering sections themselves, rather than let them pass to speculators who would fence them off from common use. He had already spoken to the bank, he said, and the mathematics were workable if enough ranchers joined the effort. There was argument. There was doubt. There was the particular stubbornness of men who had built things alone and were not naturally inclined to trust their fortunes to a collective. Isaiah listened to all of it without interrupting, and when it had run its course, he said calmly that he would not tell any man what decision to make, but that he himself intended to proceed, and the offer was open to anyone who wanted to join him. 7 ranchers ultimately did. The land deal was arranged over the following month, and the bordering sections passed to the collective rather than to the Fort Worth firm. No one made a dramatic production of this, but Kate heard it discussed in Me Ellen's kitchen with a kind of quiet pride that she found deeply telling about the kind of man Isaiah Holloway was. December arrived with a cold that settled into the bones of the building and required Kate to keep the wood stove burning from early morning until well into the night. The children wore their coats indoors on the worst days, and she taught arithmetic with mittens on, which the younger ones found hilarious and she found entirely acceptable. She sent letters to the school board asking for better insulation in the windows, and Arthur Denny appeared within a week with 2 other men, and a quantity of good old cloth that made an immediate difference. It was the 2nd week of December when Isaiah came to the school on a Tuesday and did not come in right away. She saw him through the window, standing by the cottonwood tree in the yard, talking to one of his ranch hands who had apparently come with him on some errand. By the time she had dismissed the children at the end of the school day and cleared the slates, he was standing at the door. "I wondered," he said, without quite meeting her eyes at first, which she found remarkable because he was generally a man who met things directly, "if you would do me the honor of having dinner at Me Ellen's on Saturday evening." Me Ellen did not run a restaurant. She ran a bakehouse 3 mornings a week. But there was a small table in Me Ellen's kitchen, and Me Ellen sometimes cooked dinner for people who were willing to pay for the privilege, and it was understood in Dustcreek that this arrangement was reserved for occasions of some significance. Kate felt the warmth rise in her face and did not try particularly hard to fight it. She looked at him, and he was looking back at her now, fully and steadily in the way he did when something mattered to him. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." Saturday came, and Me Ellen had made a pot roast with root vegetables and fresh bread, and a pie from dried apples that was so good Kate nearly said something embarrassing about it. The kitchen table was set with Me Ellen's second-best china and 2 candles, and Me Ellen herself disappeared discreetly to visit her neighbor Mrs. Yarrow for the evening, which was so tastefully managed that Kate felt a rush of affection for her that she stored alongside her other reasons to love Dustcreek. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about things they had talked about before, and things they had not yet, and there were stretches of comfortable silence that Kate had stopped finding remarkable, because silence with Isaiah was never an absence of communication. It was simply a different mode of it. He told her about his ranch with a specificity she had not heard from him before, the spring where the water ran clear and cold, the western pasture where the grass grew particularly well, the barn he was planning to expand in the spring. She understood from the way he described these things that he was sharing them with purpose, that he was showing her something he valued deeply and wanting to know if she valued it too. She told him about her teaching with the same specificity, about the boy named Daniel Ferris, Jim's son, who was 10 years old and doing mathematics 2 years above his age level, and who Kate was determined to see have opportunities that the range alone would not offer. About the little girl named Lucy Pratt, who had been silent for her first 3 weeks of school, and had last Tuesday read a passage aloud in a voice that had trembled but held. Isaiah listened to this the way he listened to everything, completely and without distraction, and when she had finished he said, "You are remarkable at what you do." She looked at him across the candles and the second-best china and said quietly, "So are you." The walk back to the schoolhouse in the cold December night was short, and he walked beside her with the comfortable proximity of something that had already been established between them without either of them explicitly establishing it. At the door of the schoolhouse, they stood, and the cold stars burned above Dustcreek with the particular brilliance that comes only on cloudless December nights on the high Texas plain. He said, "I would like to call on you properly, Miss Chandler. With your permission." She said, "You have my permission, Mr. Holloway." He nodded once, as though something had been confirmed that he had needed confirmed, and then he walked back toward where he had tied his horse, and she stood at the door watching him go, and she was smiling so broadly in the dark that it was a mercy there was no one to see it. He called on her properly through December and into January, and then through February, which was the hardest month weather-wise but which became, for Kate, one of the warmest in memory. He came on Tuesdays and Saturdays when weather permitted and sometimes on other days when it did not particularly permit, but he came anyway. She learned the shape of him across seasons, the way he moved, the way he thought, the specific quality of his attention when something concerned him. She learned that he could be funny in a way that required you to be paying attention to catch it. She learned that he had read more widely than most people in Dustcreek would have guessed, a fact he mentioned with no ceremony whatsoever, and that he had opinions about what he read, and that arguing those opinions with him was one of the genuine pleasures of her life. He brought her things without announcing them as gifts. A good lamp oil that burned cleaner than what the general store carried, saying only that Jim Ferris had gotten a new shipment, and it was better quality. A pair of good leather gloves for winter riding, offered in case she had occasion to take a horse out, saying only that there were nice trails east of town in the mornings. She rode east one Thursday morning and found, entirely coincidentally she was sure, that the trails passed reasonably close to the eastern boundary of the broken spur, and that the view of the hills from there at morning was extraordinary. By March she knew she was in love with him. She knew it with the certainty of something that has been true for a while and has only recently been properly identified. She also knew, because she was not given to self-deception, that he felt the same way about her. It was in every interaction, present and clear to anyone paying attention, which in Dustcreek meant that roughly the entire town had noticed it, and that Ellen Prout had apparently begun baking 2 celebratory pies in anticipation. What she did not know was what Isaiah Holloway had done in the 3rd week of February, on a cold afternoon when the wind was coming hard off the hills and the Dustcreek courthouse office was nearly empty. Silas Pratt was the county land registrar, a lean, careful man in his 50s who had held the position for 15 years, and who took his duties with a gravity appropriate to a man who served as the official keeper of who owned what in Harlan County, Texas. Isaiah had come to his office on a specific errand on that cold February afternoon, and what he had done was something he had been thinking about for weeks, turning it over and examining it from every angle the way he examined every significant decision, slow and thorough. He had filed an amendment to the deed of the Broken Spur Ranch. The Broken Spur deed, which had originally been filed in the name of James Elijah Holloway and subsequently transferred to Isaiah on his father's death, now contained a second name in the section designated for joint ownership. The name he had written was Kate Chandler. He had not told her. He knew perfectly well that he had not told her. He knew that a reasonable person's opinion of this act would depend substantially on the conversation he intended to have with her before any of this became relevant to her life, which was the conversation he had been building toward since December and which he intended to have soon. He was not, in his own understanding of it, doing anything underhanded. He was expressing in the most concrete possible terms a commitment he had already made privately, and he fully intended to explain all of this to Kate and to ask her whether she wanted it. And if she said no, then he would go back to Silas Pratt's office and have the amendment reversed, and that would be that. What he had not adequately accounted for was the cascade of circumstance that the following weeks would produce. In late March, a land dispute arose between Isaiah and a neighboring rancher named Dolph Crater, who claimed that the spring rains had shifted a boundary marker and that 3 acres of Broken Spur land along the north fence were rightfully his. Isaiah did not believe this, but he did not want a bad-natured conflict with a neighbor, and so he agreed to have the county land registrar review the original deed documents and the surveyor's notes. Silas Pratt obligingly produced the deed, including all its amendments, and copied out the relevant portions for both parties. Isaiah received his copy, reviewed the boundary language, confirmed that the marker had not moved, and filed a formal clarification. The dispute was resolved in his favor within a week, without requiring anything more dramatic than the documentation. What he failed to notice in the course of this entirely administrative proceeding was that when Silas Pratt copied the deed amendment information for his files, a second copy of that paperwork was generated, and it was filed in the county's general land records, which were public, and which were occasionally reviewed by various parties for various purposes. The purpose in this case was the Dustcreek School Board, specifically Arthur Denny, who was reviewing the county records in the first week of April in connection with a formal application the school was making to the Texas State Education Board for a grant to expand the schoolhouse building. The application required confirmation of the land on which the school sat and its surrounding properties, and Arthur Denny, being a thorough man, was reviewing adjacent property records as part of his documentation. He found the Broken Spur Amendment, read it, and sat quietly for a moment with the expression of a man who has unexpectedly found himself holding information that is both interesting and delicate. He was a decent man, and he considered his options carefully. He did not want to meddle. He also, however, had a formal obligation to ensure accuracy in the school board's documentation, and the fact that the schoolteacher's name appeared on an adjacent land deed was potentially relevant to the question of conflicts of interest that the state board occasionally raised. He spoke privately to Silas Pratt, who confirmed the amendment was legitimate and registered, and who may have sighed in a way that conveyed the particular feeling of a man who fears he has contributed to a situation. Arthur Denny then did what he considered the most neutral thing possible, which was to inform Kate Chandler that there appeared to be a document involving her name at the county registrar's office that she might want to review personally. Kate heard this on a Tuesday morning with her class of 14 children engaged in their arithmetic slates in front of her, and something in Arthur Denny's manner when he said it, a quality of delicacy that he did not typically have reason to exercise, made her put her book down carefully and asked me, Ellis Pratt's eldest daughter, who was 15 and occasionally helped in the classroom, to watch the children for the afternoon. She walked to the county office on 4th Street and told Silas Pratt that she had been advised to review a document involving her name. Silas Pratt looked at her over his spectacles with an expression she could not immediately interpret. He brought out the deed amendment from the Broken Spur file and set it on the counter in front of her. She read it once. Then she read it again, slowly. The deed had been amended to list Catherine Alina Chandler as co-owner, in equal standing, of the Broken Spur Ranch and all its associated land, buildings, livestock, and improvements, which were enumerated in the original deed documentation to which this amendment was appended. Her name was on that deed. Her full, formal name, which she had never told Isaiah Holloway, which he had therefore obtained from the school board records or from Arthur Denny or from some other source, and which he had written with his own hand onto this document. Her name was on that deed, and she had not said yes. She had not been asked. She stood at Silas Pratt's counter for a long moment with a feeling she could not entirely parse. It was not a simple feeling. There was something in it that was deeply, profoundly moved, because she understood what it meant. She understood that it was the most concrete and irreversible expression of intention that a man in Isaiah Holloway's world could produce. Half the Broken Spur. His father's land, his life's work, her name on it in his hand. But there was also something that was angry, quietly but genuinely angry, because he had not asked her. He had made a decision about her life, about her name, about her future, without asking whether she wanted those things. And she was not a woman who accepted decisions made on her behalf without her voice. Not from her father's estate attorney 3 years ago, who had handled everything as though she were not present. Not from the school board in Virginia that had paid her 60 cents for every dollar the male teachers received. And not from a cowboy who happened to be the finest man she had ever known. She thanked Silas Pratt, who looked like he wanted very badly to say something and was exercising considerable restraint in not doing so, and she walked out of the office and stood on 4th Street in the April sunshine and took 3 deliberate breaths. Then she went to find Isaiah Holloway. He was at the feed and grain store, as it happened, which struck her later as appropriate given where she had first seen him. He was talking to the owner, a man named Gil Akers, about a grain order for the spring, and he looked up when she came through the door, and something in her face must have told him immediately because his expression shifted and he straightened. "Miss Chandler," he said, with the particular care of a man who senses that the ground has changed. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I have just come from Silas Pratt's office." Gil Akers discovered with remarkable speed that he had business in the back room that required his immediate personal attention. Isaiah looked at her across the empty front of the feed store. He said nothing for a moment. Then he removed his hat. "You saw the deed," he said. It was not a question. "I saw the deed," she confirmed. "My name is on it." "Yes," he said, "you put it there." "I did. Without asking me." He held her gaze. "Yes, without asking you first, and that was wrong. I knew it when I did it, and I have not had a day since that I have not intended to speak to you about it." He paused. "I intended to tell you, Kate." It was the first time he had used her given name without the prefix, and it landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. She kept her expression steady with the particular discipline that teaching had given her. "What were you going to tell me?" she asked. He turned his hat in his hands and looked at it for a moment, and then looked back at her. "That I put your name there because it already felt like the most accurate thing I could do. Because this land, this place, the way I have felt since you came here, I wanted there to be something real that said what I could not quite say out loud. I know that is not a proper excuse." His voice was quiet and even, the way it always was, but there was something beneath it that she had not heard before, something that cost him. "I know that you are a woman who has made her own way and makes her own choices, and that putting your name on anything without your voice in it is exactly the kind of thing you have a right to object to. and I would not argue with you if you told me to go back to Silas Pratt's office and have it reversed." He stopped. In the silence outside, a horse passed on the street and someone called a greeting to someone else, and the ordinary afternoon continued without concern for the two of them standing in the feed store with everything between them exposed and waiting. Kate said, "Did you mean it?" He met her eyes fully. "Every word of it, the land and everything it means." "Then do not reverse it," she said. He stared at her. "But," she added, with the precision she brought to all important things, "you are going to ask me the question you should have asked before you went to Silas Pratt's office. You are going to ask it properly, and you are going to ask it now, while I am standing here, and I am going to answer it, because I will not have my name on any deed or any document or anything else in this world without my own voice having said yes to it. Do you understand me?" Something happened to his face that she had not seen before. It was not quite a smile, and it was not quite relief, and it was something more than either. He looked at her for a moment that stretched and held. He set his hat on the counter. He said, "Kate Chandler, I love you. I have loved you since somewhere around October, and I was not smart enough to say it plainly before I went and did something foolish and bold and probably backward. Would you be my wife? Would you share the broken spur with me, not because your name is on a piece of paper, but because you want to? Because I want to spend the rest of whatever time God gives me having exactly this kind of conversation with you, and I cannot think of a better person in the world to have it with." The afternoon light came through the feed store window and lay in long, warm bars across the floor between them. Kate Chandler looked at Isaiah Holloway, at his serious face and his hat sitting on the counter and the way he was holding himself completely still, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to say and found it to be not heavy but the opposite of heavy. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, and you will never put my name on anything again without asking me first." "Never again," he said, and now the smile came, full and unguarded, and it changed his whole face, and she thought she could look at it for a very long time. They were married in June, on a Saturday when the wild grasses along the Dustcreek road were high, and the hills in the distance were purple with early morning light. Ellen Prout baked the wedding cake, a towering arrangement of 3 tiers that was frankly the most impressive thing Kate had ever seen come out of that kitchen, and Arthur Denny gave Kate away because she had no father, and because she and Arthur Denny had developed a genuine mutual regard over the course of the school year that made the gesture feel right. The church was full. Every family whose children attended the school was there. Most of the ranchers from the collective Isaiah had organized in November were there. The fiddle player from Bixar County was there, because Ellen had written to him specifically. Jim Farris from the general store was there, and Gil Akers, and Silas Pratt, who smiled at Kate in the church doorway with the particular warmth of a man who is glad a thing has resolved well. Kate wore her green dress, the best one, and she had sewn a collar of cream-colored lace onto it with careful evening work over the previous month. She wore her mother's pearl earrings from the cedar box. She carried a handful of Texas wildflowers that one of her students, the small and quiet Lucy Pratt, had gathered from the field behind the school that morning. Isaiah stood at the front of the church in a clean white shirt and a good dark vest and his best hat, which he removed when she walked in, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was his most honest mode of expression. Pastor Reed, a young man of about 30 who had come to Dustcreek from Georgia and who had a genuine gift for speaking plainly and well, conducted the ceremony. When he reached the part where he asked if Kate Chandler would take Isaiah Holloway as her husband, she said yes the same way she had said it in the feed store, with her whole voice and her whole meaning, and she felt Isaiah's hand tighten on hers. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the yard that lasted into the evening, with the fiddle and the food and the particular warmth of a community that had found something to genuinely celebrate. Kate danced with Isaiah, who had claimed in October not to dance, but who it turned out simply had not found the right occasion. He was not a graceful dancer, not exactly, but he was steady and present, and she laughed against his shoulder and he laughed too, and it was a fine thing. They drove out to the broken spur in the early evening, while the sky was still streaked with the gold and pink of the long June sunset, and Isaiah helped her down from the wagon at the front of the ranch house, and they stood for a moment looking at the land together, the western pasture and the spring to the north, and the hills rolling away in every direction in the last light. She had been to the broken spur several times in the spring, in the months after the feed store and before the wedding, because Isaiah had understood that she needed to know what she was choosing, and he had shown her all of it. Every field, every boundary, the spring, the barn, the house itself with its solid stone walls that his father had built, and the additions that Isaiah had made over the years. She had sat in the kitchen and understood its proportions and looked at the bedroom that had window facing east toward the hills and had thought about morning light on those hills and felt something settle inside her. But coming to it now as home was different. It was the difference between knowing a thing and living it. "Well," she said, looking out at her land. "Well," said Isaiah. She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and there was so much between them that it could have been enormous and complicated, but was instead, in this moment, perfectly simple. She kissed him there at the front of the house, in the last of the June evening light, with the whole of the broken spur spread around them, and he held her with the same focused care that he brought to everything he valued. The first full summer at the broken spur taught Kate things she had not known she needed to know. She continued teaching through the school year, riding into town in the mornings on a good-tempered roan mare that Isaiah had selected for her with great care and several weeks of deliberate assessment, and she came back in the afternoons to a life that was larger and more physical than anything she had lived before. She learned to put up preserves in August. She learned the names of the ranch hands, 4 of them, steady and capable men who were respectful of her and who she came to regard warmly. There was old Pete Navarro, who had worked the broken spur since Isaiah's father's time, and who knew every acre of it better than he knew his own hand. There was young Carlos, Pete's nephew, who was 18 and energetic and who Kate quietly suspected had a deep and hopeless admiration for Lucy Pratt's older sister Clara, a situation she did not interfere with but watched with interest. There was a man named Ben Holt who had come up from the Nueces River country 2 years prior and spoke little but worked excellently. And there was Hector Ruiz, the foreman, a lean and capable man of 35 who managed the ranch operations with quiet authority and treated Kate from her first day with an easy respect that she was glad of. She learned to read the range the way Isaiah read it, understanding what the color of the grass said about moisture, what the movement of cattle across the pasture said about what they were sensing. She did not become a ranch hand. She was a school teacher, and she intended to remain one, but she became something she valued in herself, which was a full and functioning part of this place and this life. Isaiah, for his part, learned things from her that she had not expected to be teaching. He came to the school one afternoon in October of their first married year and sat in the back of the room and watched her teach, and at dinner that evening he was quieter than usual and she asked him what he was thinking. He said, "I was watching you with the Denny girl, the little one. She is having trouble with reading, is not she?" Kate said, "She is, but she is getting better. I think she has difficulty perceiving the letters as others do. They sometimes appear reversed or confused to her. It takes longer and different methods." He thought about this. Then he said, "My father used to say he could not read a map properly. North and south always switched in his head. He said he just had to know the land itself instead. I always thought it was just his own stubbornness." Kate looked at him across the table. Perhaps it was something else. He nodded slowly, and then he said, "Is there anything I can do to help her?" She loved him precisely and particularly for asking that. He began reading in the evenings, books from her collection, with an appetite that surprised her only until she remembered that he had always had the mind for it, and had simply been living a life that did not offer enough quiet hours to exercise it. He read history and natural philosophy, and the agricultural journals she had begun subscribing to from the University of Texas, and he brought what he read into their conversations with the pleasure of a man who has found a new tool that fits his hand well. In December of their first married year, Kate told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, because she was not a woman who required dramatic settings for important announcements, and because breakfast at the Broken Spur was its own kind of ceremony, the two of them at the kitchen table in the early light with coffee and the sounds of the ranch coming awake outside. He went very still. And then he set his coffee cup down with the deliberate care of someone managing a very large feeling in a small space, and he looked at her, and she could see it move across his face, the full weight of it. "Kate," he said. "In July, I think," she said, "or late June." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took both her hands in his and stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Are you well? Do you need anything? We should write to Dr. Hale." "I am perfectly well," she said, with the affectionate certainty of a woman who knows her own body. "And yes, we will write to Dr. Hale. Sit down and eat your breakfast, Isaiah." He sat back down, but he kept one of her hands across the table and held it. And he was still holding it when Hector knocked on the door to say that the south fence had a section down, and Isaiah said he would be out in 5 minutes and went back to his breakfast without releasing her hand, and Kate thought there was no one in the world she would rather share a table with. The news moved through Dustcreek with the speed that important news always moves in small places. Ellen came out to the ranch herself on a Tuesday with a basket of provisions and a list of advice, some of which was practical, and some of which was the particular folk wisdom of experienced women that Kate received with respectful noncommittal, and all of which was offered with the genuine warmth that made Ellen herself so valuable. Arthur Denny shook Isaiah's hand at the next school board meeting with an emotional warmth that surprised everyone in the room, including Arthur Denny. Kate continued teaching through the winter and into the spring. She adjusted her schedule as her body required adjustment, which it did with the straightforward logic of a body that was doing something enormous and did not have time for pretense. She sat more. She let Ellen's daughter help in the classroom on the afternoons when she was most tired. She kept teaching. In late June, when the heat was back and the range was the color of old gold, their son was born. Dr. Hale came from town, and the labor was long but ultimately uncomplicated, and Kate emerged from it with the specific quality of exhaustion and exhilaration that she had been told about but had not been able to imagine accurately until she was in it. Isaiah had been pacing the outer room of the house for so many hours that Pete Navarro had apparently offered twice to come and sit with him, which Isaiah had apparently declined twice with the polite rigidity of a man who is holding himself together by force of will. When Dr. Hale came out and told him it was done, Kate had heard his exhaled breath from inside the bedroom, a sound so unguarded that she had to press her face into the pillow to contain the feeling it gave her. He came in and sat beside her on the bed and looked at the boy she was holding, who was red-faced and squinting, and had a remarkable amount of dark hair for someone so recently arrived in the world. "James," Isaiah said. It was the name they had agreed on for his father, and she had been the one to suggest it and had watched something open in Isaiah's face when she did. "James Elijah Holloway," Kate confirmed. Isaiah touched the boy's cheek with one finger, with the same focused gentleness he brought to everything delicate. Then he looked at Kate with an expression she had no adequate word for, something that encompassed gratitude and wonder, and a love so large it had nowhere particular to point itself. "Are you all right?" he asked, quiet. "Very much so," she said. He took her free hand and held it and sat there on the edge of the bed with the June heat outside and the light coming through the east window and the sounds of the ranch carrying on. And Kate thought about her small room at the schoolhouse in August of the previous year. The narrow iron bed and the cedar box on the windowsill and the particular aloneness of a life she had been building in a direction she had not yet been able to see. She thought about how a person can be walking towards something for years without knowing it, and how the arrival is both a surprise and a recognition, as though some part of you had already been there waiting. James Elijah Holloway grew at the rate that healthy boys grow, which is to say astonishingly fast, and in ways that never cease to astonish. He had Isaiah's dark eyes and Kate's way of going very still and considering a thing before he moved on it, which at 11 months old manifested primarily in the examination of interesting rocks, but which Kate suspected would serve him well later. She returned to teaching that fall with James in the care of a woman named Rosa Navarro, Pete's wife, who came to the ranch 3 mornings a week and who handled James with the confident ease of a woman who had raised 5 of her own. Kate rode into town on the roan mare through the September mornings with the particular richness of a person who has so much on either end of the journey that the journey itself is pleasure. The school had grown. There were 19 children now, several of them from the families of new settlers who had come to the county in the past year, drawn by the railroad's expansion and by the land availability that the collective arrangement had stabilized. Kate wrote to the school board in the spring requesting a second classroom and an additional teacher, and was gratified when the request was granted, partly due to the state grant that Arthur Denny's careful documentation had secured. The new teacher was a young woman named Grace Albright, newly arrived from Ohio, and Kate took an immediate and genuine liking to her, and spent the better part of October helping her understand Dustcreek and its children, and its particular way of being a community. Isaiah's ranch operations continued to expand in the steady way of a well-managed operation that is consistently and carefully improved. He added a new section to the barn in the fall of their second year, the expansion he had mentioned before they were married, and Kate went out to look at it when it was done and ran her hand along the new timber and felt a proprietary satisfaction in it that she enjoyed. He brought on a new hand, a young man of 22 named Elias Wright, who had come up from San Antonio with good references and better skills, and who Carlos promptly befriended to their mutual benefit. The ranch hands ate supper at the main house on Sunday evenings, a tradition Kate had established in their first month of marriage, because she had grown up in a house where the table was always long enough, and she did not see the reason to change that now. Carlos did eventually, in the spring of their 3rd year, go speak to Clara Pratt's father, a conversation that Kate heard about secondhand from me Ellen with great pleasure. Clara Pratt's father, who was a practical man and who had watched Carlos Navarro work and knew his character, gave his permission readily. Clara and Carlos were married the following autumn in the same church where Kate and Isaiah had been married, and Kate sat in the pew with James on her knee and Isaiah's arm along the back of the bench behind her, and felt the specific warmth of watching a happiness you had watched build itself over time. The Dustcreek schoolhouse's expansion brought the building a new reputation in the county, and the school began to attract students from farther out, children whose families had not previously had access to formal education. Kate fought quietly but consistently for the inclusion of the Mexican and mixed heritage children whose families worked the surrounding ranches and farms, a fight that was not without resistance from certain quarters of the community. She had allies in this, Isaiah chief among them, who spoke at the school board meeting on the subject with the same plain-spoken authority he had brought to the land dispute 2 years prior. It was not a simple fight, and it was not entirely won in any single moment. But by the spring of their 4th year in Dustcreek, the school had 26 children, and Kate intended every one of them to learn to read and to calculate, and to understand that their minds were assets no one could take from them. Daniel Farris, the boy with the exceptional mathematical aptitude, turned 14 in the spring of that year, and Kate had a careful, specific conversation with Jim Farris and his wife about the matter of Daniel's education and the possibility of the University of Texas at Austin, which had been accepting students since 1883, and which Kate believed Daniel had a genuine chance of attending if his preparation was right. Jim Ferris was surprised, then doubtful, then intrigued, and then, in the way of a father who has been shown something about his child that he had not quite let himself see before, moved. It took another 2 years of planning and correspondence and considerable effort on Kate's part, but Daniel Ferris went to Austin in 1877 and wrote her a letter upon arrival that she kept in the cedar box with her mother's jewelry. The second pregnancy came in the fall of their 4th year, and this time Kate had more company in her knowledge of what to expect and more peace in the knowledge that she was in a place and a life that could hold it well. Isaiah's response this time was quieter, not because the joy was less, but because he was past the part where the joy was an emergency, and what she saw in him now was simply a man settling deeper into the life they were building. Their daughter was born in early summer in the heat and the long days, and they named her Eliza, for no one specific, because they agreed it was simply a name that sounded like itself, which was sufficient. Eliza arrived with her mother's brown hair and a volume of opinion about the world that declared itself immediately and did not moderate in the weeks that followed. James was 3 by then, old enough to be fascinated by and mildly suspicious of his new sister, and he spent the first several weeks of her life conducting a careful assessment that eventually resolved into the protectiveness that Kate had suspected was coming. She had stepped back from full-time teaching when James was born, managing her role with the help of Grace Albright and a careful restructuring of her hours, and she continued in this adjusted capacity through Eliza's early years, because she had not come to Dustcreek to stop being a teacher, and she had no intention of doing so. The summer Eliza turned 2 was the summer Isaiah had the well deepened to improve the water supply for the expanded herd, and the summer he and Kate finally built the addition onto the back of the ranch house that they had been discussing and planning since the first year of their marriage. It was 2 rooms, a study for Kate where she could read and write and prepare her lessons, and a room that could serve as a guest room when Ellen came out for the Sunday suppers that had become a cherished institution. Ellen having become sufficiently close to both of them that her presence at the Broken Spur was as natural as the furniture. Kate furnished the study with her books, all of them now, her collection having grown substantially over 4 years of deliberate acquisition. She put her writing desk against the wall beneath the window that faced the hills, and she put her mother's cedar box on the edge of the desk where the morning light would catch it, and she sat in the chair and looked out at the hills and felt the specific peace of a space that is entirely and authentically oneself. Isaiah came and stood in the doorway and looked at the room and looked at her, and she looked back at him. "It suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed. "Come in, sit down." He sat in the second chair she had placed for precisely this purpose, and he looked at the books and the desk and the cedar box and the view, and she could see him understanding all of it. "I have something to tell you," she said. He gave her his full, complete attention. "Grace is ready to take the school on herself," Kate said. "She has been ready for a year. I think I will step back to 2 days a week and spend more time here." She paused. "I have been thinking about writing, not letters or lesson plans. Something longer. There is a great deal about this place and this time that should be recorded." He considered this for a moment. Then he said, "You would be remarkable at that." "I know," she said, which was not arrogance but a simple and honest assessment, and he laughed and she laughed, and the study filled with the sound of it. She wrote. She began in the evenings and the quiet mornings, a record of Dustcreek and its people and its particular moment in the history of the territory, which became the state of Texas just 3 years after her arrival, and which she witnessed with the attentiveness she brought to everything. She wrote about the land collective and the fight for the common range. She wrote about the school and the children who had passed through it. She wrote, carefully and with attention to the complexity, about the injustices she had witnessed and the ways that the community had and had not grappled with them. She wrote about the Mexican families who worked the range and the way the legal and social systems of the territory treated them as lesser than the law claimed everyone to be. She wrote it plainly and honestly, because she believed that plainness and honesty were the appropriate registers for important things. She showed Isaiah the first completed section one evening after the children were asleep, handing him the sheaf of pages across the kitchen table. He read it without interrupting himself all the way through, and when he finished, he set the pages down and was quiet for a moment. "You should send this to the Dallas Morning News," he said. She had been thinking the same thing but had not said it yet. "You think so?" "I think it is too important not to send somewhere," he said, "and I think you know that." She did know it. She sent a portion of it to the Dallas Morning News in early spring, and received a letter of reply within 3 weeks that began with an expression of considerable interest and ended with a request for more. The spring of their 6th year was also the spring that the land speculation firm from Fort Worth made a second attempt at Dustcreek's surrounding range, this time through a more sophisticated legal mechanism that involved purchasing the debt of several smaller ranching operations that had borrowed against their land and were struggling with the effects of a hard winter. Isaiah convened the collective again, and they spent 2 months working through a solution that involved restructuring the affected debts within the collective, rather than allowing them to be purchased by the outside firm. It was during this period of intensive effort that Kate recognized something she had not fully articulated to herself before, which was that Isaiah's instinct for collective action, for the kind of practical solidarity that held a community together against forces that would rather it fragmented, was not simply good business sense. It was a kind of conviction. It came from the same place that his honesty came from, the same place that had made him fix the church roof and then ask the pastor not to mention it. She wrote about this too, in the study with the hills in the window, and she thought about the man who had put her name on a deed without asking, and the man sitting across from her in the kitchen talking about debt restructuring with Pete Navarro and Hector Ruiz, and she understood that they were the same man entirely. One evening that spring, after the children were in bed, and the house was quiet in the way that houses with children get quiet when the children are asleep, a particular charged and appreciated quiet, she found him on the porch. He was sitting in the chair that looked east, the one she had put there specifically because the evening view to the east was its own kind of reward, and he was looking at the hills. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, and they sat for a while without speaking, because after 6 years they had accumulated a large and comfortable vocabulary of silence. Then he said, without particular lead-up, "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "When I put your name on that deed," he said, "I thought I was doing something honest. I thought, this is what is true, I will make it formal and then I will explain it." He glanced at her. "I have thought about it many times since. About why I did it that way, and I think honestly that I was afraid if I asked first you might say no, and the possibility of that was something I could not quite make room for." He looked back at the hills. "That was cowardice dressed up as boldness, and I have known it for a while." Kate held her coffee cup and looked at the hills beside him. "You told me all that in the feed store," she said, "when I asked you to ask me properly." "Not all of it," he said. "Not the fear part." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew it then too." She looked at him. "Isaiah, I said yes in the feed store. I am still saying yes. Every day of this life is yes." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the unguarded one, the one she had first seen in the June wedding light, and which still, 6 years and 2 children and 1,000 shared mornings later, did something to her chest that she was grateful for. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. They sat with the hills going dark in the east and the first stars coming on, and the broken spur settled into the evening around them. The sounds of the animals, the distant call of a nighthawk, Pete Navarro's light in the bunkhouse window. Eliza called out from inside the house, a half-awake sound that subsided before either of them stood up, and James's voice answered her, low and reassuring, because he was 5 now and took his role as older brother with a seriousness that made both his parents quietly enormous with love for him. Kate looked at Isaiah, and he was already looking at her, and she thought about the deed on Silas Pratt's counter with her name in his hand, and the anger, and the moving and the yes in the feed store in April light. And she thought about all the things that had grown up out of that moment. 2 children and a study full of books and a collective that held the range together, and Grace Albright managing the school with an ease that made Kate proud every time she walked in. And she thought that the mathematics of a life are strange and precise, that everything adds up to exactly where you are standing. "Come inside," she said. "It is getting cold." He stood and held the door for her, and she went in, and the broken spur closed around them in the warmth of the evening, and outside the stars continued their ancient work over the wide Texas range. In the years that followed, the broken spur grew, and the family grew with it. James turned 7 and began his own schooling at the Dustcreek school, where he sat in the same room his mother had once ruled, and applied himself to his studies with the combined focus of both his parents, which gave Grace Albright a student she described as both a pleasure and an occasional challenge. Eliza followed at 6, with a verbal facility that made Grace write Kate a note saying simply, "She is very much like you," which Kate received with pride and the full understanding of what it implied for classroom management. Kate's writing found a readership. The Dallas Morning News published 3 of her pieces, each one noted in the letters column by readers who wrote to say they recognized something true in what she was putting down. A publisher in San Antonio wrote to inquire whether she was working on something longer. She wrote back that she was. She was. The book was taking shape slowly and steadily, the way the broken spur itself had taken shape, through years of careful and committed work. Isaiah's collective arrangement became something of a model in the county. When similar pressures arose on ranges further east, ranchers from those areas rode to Dustcreek specifically to talk to him about how the structure had been organized and sustained. He was not a man who enjoyed being a model for anything particularly, but he explained the mathematics and the trust building with the same practical clarity he brought to everything. And if word spread that Isaiah Holloway was a man whose judgment on range and land matters could be relied on, he accepted that reputation without enlarging it. He taught James to ride properly, beginning with a gentle sorrel pony and progressing through the years with the patient thoroughness of a man who believes that a thing worth learning is worth learning correctly. He taught him to read the land and the sky and the behavior of cattle, the same things his own father had taught him, and Kate watched this transmission of knowledge with the feeling that time is not entirely linear, that some things loop back and carry forward, and the loop itself is a kind of grace. She taught James and Eliza to read in the way she had come to believe was most important, not just the letters and the words, but the willingness to sit with a difficult text and turn it over and find what was in it, the patience for meaning. She read to them in the evenings, history and stories and natural philosophy and poetry, mixing genres without concern for convention, because the goal was the love of it, and she knew from 20 years of teaching that the love came from abundance, from being given so much that you wanted it for yourself. The country was changing around Dustcreek in ways that were not always comfortable. The railroad had brought new settlers and new commerce, which was largely good, but it had also brought a faster, louder kind of business culture that did not always sit easily with the ranching communities that had built the county with their hands. There were new laws coming from Austin, some sensible and some less so, and the balance between the open range tradition and the fencing and property rights arguments that the farming newcomers brought with them was a genuine tension that played out in courts and conversations, and occasionally in night-cut fences. Isaiah navigated this with his habitual steadiness, and with the authority of a man who had been present long enough and acted well enough that his voice carried weight. He was asked 3 times by various parties whether he would consider standing for county commissioner, and 3 times he declined, because he believed he was more useful as a rancher who participated in his community than as an official of it. And this was not false modesty, but a genuine assessment of where his skills were best applied. Kate had opinions about this. She expressed them. He listened and considered and remained of his original view, and she respected the consistency even while maintaining her own position, which was that he underestimated the good he could do in an official capacity. They argued about this twice properly, with full engagement from both sides, and both times it ended the same way, which was with neither of them having changed the other's view and both of them being satisfied with the conversation anyway, because they had both grown up in the understanding that the quality of a disagreement matters as much as its resolution. Their 3rd child came in the spring of their 8th year together, a son they named William Thomas, the Thomas for Kate's absent brother, with whom she had resumed a more regular correspondence in recent years, Thomas having come to recognize, with the particular lateness of men who are wrapped up in their own lives, that he had a sister worth keeping close. William arrived red-faced and loud, and made his presence known in the household within approximately 45 minutes of his arrival, a practice he maintained with impressive consistency. James was 8 when William was born and Eliza was 5, and the adjustment of the family structure was managed with the adaptive practicality that characterizes households, where the parents are fundamentally grounded and the children are fundamentally secure. James took his older brother role even more seriously, and Eliza's relationship with William was from the beginning simultaneously exasperated and devoted, which remained its defining quality as long as Kate observed them together. Ellen Prout came for Sunday supper the first week William was home, and sat at the long table in the ranch kitchen with Pete Navarro and Hector Ruiz and Carlos and Clara Navarro, and their own 2 small children and Grace Albright, who had become one of the Broken Spur's regular Sunday company, and she looked around the room with an expression that Kate recognized as the particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched something grow well. "You did good, Kate Chandler," Ellen said, which was the first and only time anyone had used Kate's maiden name since the wedding, and which Ellen did not do with any awkwardness but with the specific tenderness of someone saying, "I knew you when, and I am glad I did." "Holloway," Kate corrected, but gently and with a smile that meant both things at once. "Holloway," Ellen agreed and raised her coffee cup. Isaiah was watching Kate from his end of the table with the expression she knew best on him, the quiet full attention of a man looking at the thing he values most, and she held his gaze across the length of the table and the company and the noise of 3 children and good friends and the life they had built, and she felt it as clearly and as certainly as she had felt it in the feed store in April of their beginning. She said later, when the company had gone and the children were asleep and the dishes were washed and the kitchen was the particular quiet and ordered place it became at the end of a full day, "Do you remember the day I found the deed?" He was at the table with his boots off and his journal open, the one in which he kept his ranch records in the careful accounting style of a man who has learned that precision is kindness to future self. He looked up. "Every detail," he said. "I was so angry," she said, with some pleasure in the recollection. "You were so angry," he agreed, with an answering pleasure. "And so moved," she said. "Were you?" He said it with genuine curiosity, as though he still, after all this time, wanted to know. "Both things at the same time," she said. "I have never figured out how they were both there at once." He closed his journal and considered this for a moment. "I think," he said, "that both things were there because you already knew what you felt about me. And the anger was because a woman like you does not have her choices made for her, not even by someone she is already falling in love with. And the moved part was because you understood what it meant that I had done it." She looked at him across the kitchen in the lamplight with the Texas night outside and their 3 children sleeping, and the whole solid good weight of everything they had built between them. "That is exactly right," she said. That is exactly what it was. He smiled, and it was the same smile she had first seen in the feed store, full and unguarded, the one that changed his whole face. "Come here," he said. She sat beside him at the table, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the shoulder that she had learned the exact shape of over 8 years of mornings and evenings and everything between them. And they sat in the good kitchen quiet while the lamp burned low, and the Texas night held everything still and safe outside. The broken spur stood on its land as it always had, the barn Isaiah had built and rebuilt, the spring running cold and clear to the north, the western pasture thick with grass in the season when grass grew thick, the hills rolling away to the east where the morning light came first. Kate's name was on the deed with Isaiah's, and had been from before she said yes, and she had said yes wholeheartedly and without reservation, and she would say it again and again across all the years that stretched before them, as many times as the morning came over those hills, and found them there together in the life they had built, steadily and with intention on the open and enduring Texas range. James grew to be a serious young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's sharpness of mind, and he went to school in Austin, as Daniel Ferris had done, and came back summers to work the broken spur with the same capable hands he had developed under Isaiah's patient instruction. Eliza developed a particular gift for language that Kate encouraged with the fierce specificity of a teacher who recognizes a real thing, and she filled notebooks with observations and stories from the time she was 7. William, for his part, was so thoroughly at home on horseback by the age of 5 that Pete Navarro declared him the best natural rider he had seen in 30 years, which Pete said with the authority of a man who had 30 years of horses to compare. Kate finished her book in the fall of their 10th year on the broken spur, and sent it to the San Antonio publisher, who had inquired 6 years prior, and who had waited with a patience that spoke well of him. The book was about Dustcreek and West Texas, and the period of its making, honest and specific and attentive to the people who built it and the injustices alongside the building. And when the publisher wrote back, he said it was the most accurate and human account of the period he had read, and that he intended to publish it in the spring. It came out in April, which felt appropriate to Kate for reasons she did not explain to anyone. Isaiah bought 12 copies from the bookstore in San Antonio, which made the bookstore owner look at him with some speculation, and he gave them to Arthur Denny and me Ellen and Pete Navarro and Hector and Silas Pratt and Grace Albright and Jim Ferris and several others, with the same matter-of-fact generosity he brought to everything he gave. Me Ellen read hers in 2 days and came out to the ranch on the 3rd morning with red eyes and an expression of fierce pride and a basket of cinnamon rolls, and she sat in Kate's study in the chair that was there for company and said, "This is the truest thing I have ever read about this place." Kate thanked her and meant it with everything she had. The afternoon of the day me Ellen came, Kate sat at her desk with the hills in the window and the cedar box at the edge of the desk, and the particular quiet of the study around her, and she thought about the stage from San Antonio in the August heat of 1873, the smell of horses and dust, and me Ellen's baking, the 2 trunks and the cedar box, and the exhaustion of a person who has been alone and building toward something she cannot see yet. She thought about a man loading sacks outside the feed and grain in the gold afternoon light, and the way he had looked up and caught her looking and nodded, once, with the serious politeness of a man who did not perform what he felt. She thought about her name on a deed she had not signed yet, her full name in a hand that was not hers, and the strange double feeling of it, the anger and the moving, both of them true and both of them right. She opened the cedar box and took out Daniel Ferris's letter from Austin and held it for a moment, then replaced it carefully. She took out her mother's pearl earrings and held them in her palm and thought about Virginia and about what her mother might have made of this life, this study, this land, this man. She thought she would have liked him. She thought she would have recognized in him the same things Kate had recognized, the honesty and the steadiness and the way he carried his love for things in actions rather than performances. She thought her mother would have sat at the long Sunday table and been exactly at home. Outside the window, across the eastern yard, James was coming in from the far pasture on his horse, sitting tall the way his father sat, and William was running toward him across the grass in the particular full-speed, unreserved way of 5-year-olds. And James was already pulling up the horse and swinging down to catch his brother in the easy, practiced way of a boy who has always had someone to catch. Kate watched them through the window and placed the earrings back in the box and closed it. Isaiah appeared in the doorway of the study. He leaned against the frame and looked at her, then followed her gaze out the window to where the boys were now walking toward the barn together, William's short legs working double time to match the longer stride. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. He came into the study and stood behind her chair and put his hands on her shoulders, and she put one of her hands up to cover one of his, and they stood looking out at the hills together, the same hills she had first seen from the wagon in the gold evening of their beginning, still rolling away to the east in the unchanging and essential way of things that were there before you and will be there after you and which are, for the time that you are given, yours. "Kate," he said. "Isaiah," she said. Outside, Eliza's voice rose from somewhere in the direction of the cottonwood tree that grew by the water trough, calling something to her brothers, and the afternoon held it all. The voices and the hills and the study full of books and the cedar box on the desk and the deed in the county office with both their names on it. Both of them written there now, and everything said yes.